Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, July 10th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The Israeli military controls 26% of Gaza. So Haaretz reported on Monday that the Israeli military has taken control of 26% of the Gaza Strip and is building bases and paving roads in the areas that it controls to ensure long-term occupation, which could lead to Jewish settlements. So we're not talking about, when we say that they control these areas, it's not just that the military is there. They've also completely demolished everything that was there for the most part, destroyed the agricultural land, and started building military bases. And Israel established what it calls a buffer zone along the entire Israel-Gaza border by demolishing buildings in that area, and that zone cuts about 1 kilometer into Gaza along the entire border. And this is something I've covered before. I think it's really important because, again, this shows how Israel is currently, taking parts of Gaza. And that buffer zone accounts for about 16% of Gaza's territory. They've also taken control of the Philadelphia corridor, which is the border of Gaza and Egypt, and they have also created what they call the Netzarim corridor, which is a pretty wide area. It's 38 square kilometers, and that separates northern Gaza from the rest of the Strip. And if you see this Haaretz report that they published, it's one of these interactive things where you could scroll down and see all sorts of pictures, and they have the overhead shot of these areas that Israel has taken control of. And then they show the satellite images of this Netzarim corridor before October 7th and what it looks like today. And, you see plenty of buildings, green, lush, what looks like agricultural land. And then if you scroll down to what it looks like now, it's just a complete wasteland. So the before and after is just really almost shocking to look at. I mean, it's just the whole land, it's just destroyed. And there's just a few buildings that they left standing, including the Turkish hospital, which is a military base now. So the Turkish hospital is the only cancer treatment hospital in Gaza. And the Israeli military now uses it as a base. So there's some history here. There was an Israeli settlement called Netzarim that used to be located where the Turkish hospital was built. And all Israeli settlements in Gaza were evacuated by 2005 as part of this policy known as the disengagement. But the Netzarim settlement, the way that Haaretz actually described it, they said that this particular settlement, the Netzarim settlement, was part of an Israeli government plan to bisect Gaza and strengthen Israeli control by means of civilian settlements. And again, we're talking before 2005. Today, Israeli soldiers in Gaza are taking symbolic steps to show their support for reestablishing Jewish settlements in the territory. And they're posting these videos and sharing them on social media. And one of these videos, there's a few examples in the report. One shows a uniformed Israeli soldier placing a large menorah, in a building near the Turkish hospital, so in this same place where this Jewish settlement once was. And this menorah was said to be the same one that was removed from a synagogue that was in the Netzarim settlement before it was evacuated. So, and there's other things about Israeli soldiers, again, putting out, calling for, settlements and things like that. So this Netzarim corridor is also where the U.S. Pier was built. And there is graffiti written in Hebrew near this pier that says, "Without settlement, there's no victory." So Netanyahu has denied that establishing Jewish settlements in Gaza was one of his goals, but members of his coalition government and his Likud party openly support this idea, as well as the expulsion of Palestinians, and they're not shy about it. I put in a quote here from Shlomo Karhi, who is the communications minister and a member of the Likud party, This was at a pro-settlement march in May. He said, quote, "In order to preserve the security achievements that our soldiers lost their lives for, we must resettle Gaza with security forces and settlers that will embrace the land with love," end quote. So Ben-Gvir was at the same march and called for the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza. And even though, we know that this is something that the Israeli government, ultimately wants to do, whether or not Netanyahu publicly says it, there's been reports that he has said, he was looking at trying to find countries that will absorb Palestinians from Gaza, as was how he put it. And back in October 2023, one of the first big leaks that came out was a document prepared by Israel's intelligence ministry that was leaked to the media. It said that the best post-war scenario for Israel would be the expulsion of all 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza, all of them. That plan said send them to Egypt. Egypt hasn't let them in, isn't going for that. So, I think they're probably trying to think of other plans. But for now, what they're doing is kind of, taking over this territory, and I'd be surprised if they give it back anytime soon. So, and this is another thing when we get to the U.S. always says, "Oh, we don't support any post-war plan that involves, Gaza's territory shrinking." Well, Gaza's territory has already shrunk. Again, they're not just occupying these areas; they didn't just take control; they've just completely leveled everything there. All right, so the next one here, the IDF says Hamas will still be in Gaza 5 years from now. So Israeli Defense Forces spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari has said that Hamas will still be in Gaza 5 years from now. In his latest comments that cast doubt on Netanyahu's goal of eliminating the Palestinian group, Hagari told ABC, quote, "Israel is planning a long war against Hamas. Will you and me be talking 5 years from now about Hamas as a terror organization in Gaza? The answer is yes," end quote. So Hagari made similar comments recently that were more directly critical of Netanyahu's goal. That was while I was on vacation, one of the things that I mentioned when I got back, because this is the Israeli military. This is the spokesman for the Israeli military saying this thing that the prime minister is saying we're going to do, we can't do it. So in that time, he said, quote, "This business of destroying Hamas, making Hamas disappear, it's simply throwing sand in the eyes of the public. Hamas is an idea. Hamas is a party. It's rooted in the hearts of the people. Whoever thinks we can eliminate Hamas is wrong," end quote. So Netanyahu responded to his latest comments and apparently criticized him privately. According to Israeli media, this is what Netanyahu said in response to Hagari, quote, "There are also members of Hamas in the West Bank, but there is no Hamas rule. There are neo-Nazis in Germany, but there is no Nazi rule. Israel will eliminate Hamas's rule and will not allow it to control the Gaza Strip again and threaten Israel from there," end quote. So Hamas has been able to reestablish itself in some of the cities that have been almost completely decimated by Israeli forces, including Gaza City and Khan Yunis. The Israeli military has reinvaded some areas several times now, demonstrating that these genocidal tactics of just killing everybody, destroying all the buildings, they're not achieving Netanyahu's stated goal. Important that I put stated there because we probably know what his real goal is. The U.S. continues to provide strong military and political support for Israel despite Netanyahu's own military saying that his main goal cannot be achieved. That hasn't stopped the bomb shipments. Netanyahu is also sabotaging the chances of a ceasefire, which we'll get into. And, I mean, it's just despicable that the U.S. is still supporting this thing as much as it is. Which is as much as it, possibly can. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. to permanently remove the pier that it built off the coast of Gaza. So the Associated Press reported on Tuesday that the pier the U.S. military built off the coast of Gaza will be reattached to the shore on Wednesday and then permanently removed after a few days. The idea is to clear aid that has piled up in Cyprus and on the offshore floating dock before ending the mission, which has not brought any relief to the starving Palestinians in Gaza. Aid groups have criticized the pier as a public relations stunt to make it appear that the U.S. was doing something to get more aid into Gaza while continuing to support the Israeli military's genocidal war and starvation blockade. President Biden ordered the construction of the pier instead of pressuring Israel to open more land border crossings, which is by far the most efficient way to get more aid into the Strip. So the Pentagon initially estimated that the pier would cost $320 million to build and operate for 90 days, but later revised the estimate to $230 million. Either way, it's a crazy amount of money to spend on something like this, on what is essentially a floating dock. I mean, you could build like a port for less than that. The Pentagon also had to spend $22 million on repairs after the pier was damaged by heavy seas. The pier was removed from the coast several times due to the weather that it could not handle. It was designed to be safely operated in a maximum of 3-foot waves and winds less than 15 miles per hour, and heavier conditions are common in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. All the reports say that in the summer it's calmer. We didn't expect this weather. But 3 feet, 15 mile per hour winds. I mean, that's really not much. Aid delivered through the pier also couldn't be delivered due to the security situation for aid groups. On June 9th, the UN's World Food Program halted operations in the area after the Israeli military struck its warehouses during the massive assault on Nuseirat that killed over 270 Palestinians and freed 4 Israeli hostages. It's also the allegations that Israel used the pier as during that military operation. There was videos of a Israeli helicopter landing nearby. And there was also allegations from Palestinians, as well as the Palestinian Red Crescent Society said that some of the Israeli soldiers on the ground showed up in an aid truck. So the UN says it's investigating all of that. So the completely failed, this has been just one of the most pathetic attempts at acting like they're doing something here, this whole pier project. All right, so the next one here, dozens of Palestinians killed in Israeli raid on Gaza encampment. This one is from Al Jazeera. So Israeli air raids in Gaza have killed dozens of people, and advancing Israeli army tanks in Gaza City have also forced residents to flee under fire. On Tuesday, an air raid hit the tents of displaced families outside a school in the town of Abbasan, east of Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, killing at least 29 people, most of them women and children. Palestinian medical officials said. The director of Gaza's government media office said that dozens of others were killed in other Israeli attacks in central Gaza, and said at least 60 Palestinians were killed on Tuesday. So that's a lot. And I mean, this looks like another massacre at a tent camp that they bombed here in this town east of Khan Yunis that was right next to a school that was sheltering people. Just another horrific massacre. As long as this thing goes on, this will continue. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu does not want to deal with Hamas. So a senior Israeli official has told Al Monitor that it's clear Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu does not want a ceasefire and hostage deal with Hamas after he released his list of non-negotiable demands ahead of sensitive negotiations. This story might seem a little redundant because I've basically been going over this, how Netanyahu's trying to sabotage the chances. But, I mean, this is just all over the media. Israeli sources saying Netanyahu doesn't want to deal. He's sabotaging it. And you still see U.S. officials putting all the blame on Hamas. Again, it's just so... pathetic is the word that just keeps coming to mind here. Like, the propaganda is just so pathetic. So this Israeli official said, quote, anyone wanting to succeed in fateful and difficult negotiations does not emphasize the gaps and difficulties twice a day, but tries to emphasize the agreements and the prospects. It is clear to all of us that Netanyahu simply does not want the deal, end quote. So they think he is trying to ensure that there's no deal until he addresses Congress at the end of the month. He doesn't want to lose power. He doesn't want to miss out on that address to Congress. They also think that he might be trying to hold out until November in hopes that Trump is going to be reelected. I think that's all certainly probably true. This Al Monitor report said something else that was very interesting. Apparently, the Egyptian mediators were infuriated by Netanyahu's non-negotiable demands, while Qatari mediators were puzzled. But then you have the U.S., and the U.S. officials were the least surprised of all. The report said that the U.S. would have been surprised if Netanyahu had not thrown a spanner into the works. So the U.S. is expecting Netanyahu to try to sabotage this. All this talk about Biden wanting a ceasefire, it's all just nonsense. I mean, this just goes to show, the U.S. isn't even upset with him about this. All right. So the next one here, independent UN experts slam Israel for creating famine in Gaza. This article is from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute, Kyle Anzalone. A group of 10 independent experts studying the situation in Gaza declared that the Israeli military operations amount to genocide and have created a famine. Over the past 9 months, Israel has destroyed most of the infrastructure in Gaza and only allowed a trickle of aid to enter the besieged enclave. The officials said, quote, "We declare that Israel's intentional and targeted starvation campaign against the Palestinian people is a form of genocidal violence and has resulted in famine across all of Gaza. We call upon the international community to prioritize the delivery of humanitarian aid by land by any means necessary, end Israel's siege, and establish a ceasefire," end quote. And Israel, of course, attacked the experts and claimed that they were spreading misinformation. So just more, people coming out and declaring genocide, famine in Gaza. But just it doesn't seem to matter to the U.S. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. rules out resuming talks with Iran. So on Monday, the White House ruled out the idea of resuming negotiations related to Iran's civilian nuclear program, despite the election of a new president who seeks a revival of the Iran nuclear deal, known as the JCPOA, which the Trump administration tore up in 2018. So on the campaign trail, President-elect Masoud Pezeshkian, man, I keep butchering his name, but he's considered a reformist in Iranian politics. He vowed to work toward Western sanctions relief and favors the idea of engaging directly with the U.S. So Trita Parsi, he's the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute. He has noted that Iran seeking direct negotiations with the U.S. in the context of another Trump presidency is a significant shift in Tehran's policy. But it is unlikely that Pezeshkian will have a willing partner in negotiations, since the White House has ruled out talks and a second Trump administration is not expected to soften its stance on Iran. Trump was, they had the so-called maximum pressure campaign to put as many sanctions as they could on Iran. He killed Soleimani. We're not expecting that stance to be softened. There's no reason to think that it would be, especially if he's going to come in being super supportive of Israel. So John Kirby told reporters, quote, "We're not in a position where we're willing to get back to the negotiating table with Iran just based on the fact that they've elected a new president," end quote. And both Kirby and State Department spokesman Matt Miller have said they don't expect a change in Iran's policies as a result of the election. So amid regional escalations sparked by Israel's assault on Gaza, the U.S. and Iran have held indirect talks in Oman to avoid direct war, but there's no sign that the U.S. is interested in pursuing any negotiations that can lead to any kind of sanctions relief. All right, so the next one here, Israeli strike kills Hezbollah's leader's former bodyguard in Syria. This one is from Jason Ditz. An Israeli strike inside Syria near the Lebanon border killed 2 Hezbollah members and critically injured a Syrian driver. One of the slain was identified as Yasser Nemer Kranbish, who formerly served as a bodyguard to Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah. Hezbollah issued a statement confirming his death and said in recent years that he had been active in Syria, responsible for procuring weapons shipments for Hezbollah. The other slain Hezbollah member has not been identified yet. Hezbollah responded by firing 2 Katyusha rockets against an Israeli base in the occupied Golan Heights. 2 Israelis were reportedly killed and 2 others critically wounded in the rocket attacks. Israel retaliated again. They launched more attacks across southern Lebanon. So this daily fire, daily strikes across the border, this is in Syria, but still related to Hezbollah, continues. All right, so the next one here, Ukraine's path to NATO will be irreversible. So the NATO summit started on Tuesday. There's some stuff, I'm going to probably tomorrow have a whole bunch of stories on it, but on Tuesday, Politico reported that NATO is likely to tell Ukraine that its path toward NATO membership is irreversible during the summit that has already begun in Washington. The report said that the language is already included in a draft version of the communique that's set to be released on Wednesday. The text will be finalized on Tuesday night, but it has already been approved by the U.S. and other major NATO countries. The Politico report said that the inclusion of the language would be a stunning development for Ukraine and a major defeat for Russia. That's how Politico characterized it. But there's no sign that Ukraine is going to be given any sort of clear roadmap toward membership at the summit, meaning the communique will just be another empty promise designed to continue the proxy war. That seems like that's all this is, just saying, oh, it's irreversible. You know, we promise that you'll become a NATO member. We're not going to say when, but it's an irreversible promise. Like, I don't really see, it's just another kind of symbolic thing. At least that's what it seems like to me. But the issue of NATO's potential NATO membership, just background that I'm sure many of you are aware of, but it's important when we're talking about this issue. The issue of Ukraine's potential NATO membership was a major motivation for Russian President Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. During the lead up to the invasion, the U.S. refused to engage seriously with Russia's demands for the U.S. to give a guarantee that Ukraine would not be admitted into NATO. So they refused to engage on that. A U.S. official admitted that they didn't seriously even consider it. While at the same time, before, I linked to a report from December 2021, just a few months before the invasion, the U.S. was telling Ukraine behind the scenes that it would not become a NATO member for at least a decade. And I mean, if you're saying for at least a decade, that means it's not even a consideration of, you know, Biden during his first term or even during his second term or even, you know, the next term after that. Like, that's something that they're just completely, you know, kicking down the road. But instead of giving Russia a guarantee or even maybe offering, okay, how about no NATO membership for 10 years and we'll see how things are in 10 years. No, they just didn't engage it at all. And Ukraine was first promised it would eventually become a NATO member at a 2008 summit in Bucharest, despite the issue being a major red line for Russia. At the time, then U.S. Ambassador to Russia William Burns, the current CIA director, warned against promising NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia. He said the vow touches a raw nerve in Russia and raises serious security concerns for Moscow. And this was revealed by a cable published by WikiLeaks, one of the many reasons that WikiLeaks is so important. This cable is extremely important because it goes to show that the U.S. government was well aware that expanding NATO, giving Ukraine this promise for future membership means, is very provocative toward Russia and could spark a war, was essentially what Burns said in this cable. So since the Russian invasion, Zelensky has been looking for a clear path to NATO membership and stronger commitments. He was furious at last year's NATO summit in Vilnius when the alliance issued a vague communique that said it will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met. So just super vague. A Ukrainian official who spoke with Politico about this year's NATO summit said that other NATO members want stronger language than the U.S. This is Ola Stefanishina. She is the Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration. Said, quote, "We've had sort of an agreement with the United States, so it will be really clear that the path to membership is irreversible, but other allies are really pushing for a stronger wording. Great Britain, France, our Baltic friends all want to make sure that the wording in the declaration is stronger than what the U.S. has pushed and leaves no room for doubt," end quote. All right. So we'll see what happens with the communique. The next one here, Sweden calls on NATO to focus on China to placate Trump. This one is from Kyle again at the Libertarian Institute. It's kind of a funny story. As members of NATO gather in Washington, D.C. to celebrate the pact's 75th year, that's right, it's their big 75th anniversary, Sweden is calling on the alliance to shift some of its attention to China. Stockholm argues that this will align the bloc more with former U.S. President Donald Trump's policies. So this is the foreign minister who said the alliance should reorient some of its military assets toward Asia to confront Beijing. And we are seeing NATO bringing in more partner countries from Asia. Japan has a big presence at this year's summit. And there is, they've openly called, China a threat. And they released these documents, declaring that. So anyway, this quote, where is it? Oh, so the Swedish foreign minister said, quote, "If you want your partner to think about the things you think are a problem, you have to show commitment to their problems. And the American people are more concerned with the threat that China poses than Russia for obvious reasons," end quote. So again, just very interesting from Sweden there. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. provides a $2 billion military aid package to Warsaw. So this one is from Connor Freeman, also at the Libertarian Institute. Washington is providing its NATO ally Poland, with a second $2 billion foreign military financing package in less than a year, breaking defense reports. In recent weeks, Warsaw has given Kiev a green light to use Polish-provided weapons to strike the Russian mainland, as well as signed a bilateral military pact with Ukraine that could lead to them shooting down Russian missiles. A State Department official boasted to the outlet of how the two FMF loans, so this is a foreign military financing loan. Usually it's in the form of a grant, meaning that they don't have to pay it back. But this is the second $2 billion loan that Poland has gotten within a year. And they're saying, this is going to benefit the U.S. weapons industry as well as strengthening NATO, which is embroiled in its proxy war with Moscow. As with typical FMF loans, the funds furnished by the State Department to a foreign government must be spent on American-made weaponry and equipment. What makes this loan unique is instead of a grant to purchase arms, it includes interest, which Warsaw must repay. All right. So more stuff for Poland, and the follow-up on this military pact between Ukraine and Poland that Zelensky says includes a mechanism for Poland to shoot down Russian missiles. That is incredibly concerning, and we'll see what comes of that. If we'll get more updates on that. All right, so the last story here, the Senate proposes an automatic draft registration. This article is from Edward Hasbrook. Contrary to earlier reports, the U.S. Senate has joined the House of Representatives in moving toward a foolhardy attempt to automatically register all draft-eligible U.S. citizens and residents for a possible military draft by extracting and aggregating information obtained from other federal agencies. The proposal for automatic draft registration is among several previously undisclosed provisions related to selective service in the newly released version of the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, for the fiscal year of 2025. So this has been approved by the Senate Armed Services Committee and is to be considered by the full Senate. So basically the House version of the NDAA, which is the annual military spending bill, includes this provision for an automatic military draft. Automatic registration for the draft. And Edward says here that they initially didn't release it in the summary for the Senate's version of the NDAA. And there were claims that it didn't include it, but it turns out that it does include this provision. And so what happens is the Senate makes its version of the NDAA, then the House makes their version, and then they go to conference where they negotiate the final version. And that's usually when they strip out any of the good amendments that might defund a war or something and agree to leave in all the horrible stuff. So the fact that this is in both chambers, NDAAs, is not good. Now, he gets into the difficulties that they might have with this idea this automatic registration. Practically constructing a complete and accurate list of potential draftees and their contact information for provable delivery of induction notices from other existing federal agencies would not be easy, cheap, or automatic. The National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service studied the feasibility of passive registration for a draft based on existing databases, but eventually ruled this out as an option. A staff report to the NCMNPS released in response to one of my FOIA requests found that, quote, the integration of one or more state federal databases for a post-mobilization registration system would be an inherently difficult integration challenge, particularly as the database compilation would be using existing databases and not fielding a new data collection effort, end quote. It gets into more details about that, but basically it would be difficult. And Edward concludes the article by saying members of the U.S. Senate and House need to hear from their constituents sooner rather than later that you oppose draft registration, whether in its current form or carried out automatically, whether for men or women or both, and whether for combat or any other military assignments, and that you support the removal of the automatic draft registration from the NDAA and the reintroduction and consideration of the Selective Service Repeal Act as a standalone bill and or as an amendment to the NDAA. So let your representatives, your senators know that you are against this. That's something we could all do pretty easily. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. One from Megan Russell, Inside China, Focused Congressional Hearings, Panic, Paranoia, and Hypocrisy Reign. I mean, if you ever watch, I feel like I've said this quite a bit before, but if you ever watch any sort of congressional hearing about China, it's just completely hysterical. I mean, it's almost like, it seems like a parody. So go check that out. One from Lori Calhoun, Parody of a Statesman, Antony Blinken, Secretary of War. Certainly just one of the worst Secretary of States ever. One from Ari Paul, Assange is free, but U.S. spite will chill reporting for years. One from Andrew Coburn, why didn't you tell me about the Iraq war? One from Anatole Levin, this week, NATO 3 celebrates itself. And he's saying there was NATO 1 during the Cold War, and then there was NATO 2 after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now since they started expanding, we're in NATO 3 at the moment. 75 years, so please go check all that out. You can support this show by sharing it. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Like, subscribe, comment. I appreciate everyone that does. Follow antiwar.com on Instagram. Follow it on X. Follow me on X. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.